Thanks, Jim. So there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is Becky Ianni. She was abused when she was 8 years old and now heads a regional chapter of SNAP, the Survivors Network of those abused by priests. Jason Miller is also here, Director of Campaigns and Development for the Franciscan Action Network. With us from Boston is the former U.S. Ambassador to the Vatican, Raymond Flynn. And joining us via Skype from Dublin is Marie Collins, abused by a priest at the age of 13. She would later resign in protest from Pope Francis' commission for the protection of minors. And Marie, we're going to start with you because you're among a group of people who met with the pontiff this weekend. How did that meeting go, considering you have stepped back from the commission that was set up to basically bring victims in and make sure that justice was served?
One good thing about the meeting was it was all campaigning survivors, all except one. The others were all people who were have been representing their groups for a long time. So it was a very challenging group for him the Pope to meet. It wasn't in any way secret, and there was no question of it being kept away in a corner. Everyone was free to speak afterwards. It was a meeting where people were able to say what they wanted to say. Some of the survivors had specific things they wanted the Pope to do or to say. They were from mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries, industrial schools, institutions where abuse had taken place here in Ireland. And they wanted him to say specific things, which he did do at his mass, at his public mass the next day. He followed through with that. In my case, I had more sort of global questions for him. And I didn't really get the answers I wanted. I did get the opportunity to put my questions straight to him about accountability and about safeguarding. I didn't really get the answers I wanted, but at least there was the meeting. At least I got the opportunity, which I didn't get over 3 years as an advisor on his commission. I didn't get the opportunity to speak to him directly. At least on Saturday I did.
Just tell us a little bit about your story, because you were abused when you were 13 years old. You didn't fully detail what happened when able to until your mid-40s. This has gone on for absolutely decades for you. Just share with us how painful your journey has been.
Well, I mean, starting with the abuse, I was a sick child in hospital when the chaplain abused me, sexually assaulted me. His bishop found out what he was doing to little girls in the hospital quite soon after my abuse. All he did was take him out and put him in a parish. That priest went on to abuse little girls for a further 30 years. He raped one little girl every week for almost 3 years from the time she was 10. And this is why I feel so strongly about accountability, because if that bishop had done something, there was 30 years of victims there that could have been saved. My own life was very difficult because I suffered with very severe depressions, anxiety, panic attacks. I couldn't hold down a job. I spent 2 or 3 years with agoraphobia. I couldn't go out of my house. But when I did eventually report it, my bishop here in Dublin, who is now gone, but he was protecting this man. He wouldn't cooperate with the police. And at the same time, the people, the laity here in Ireland, were being told everything was being done correctly, everything was being done right. And that was in 1995, 96. And eventually my abuser was jailed in 1997. But I felt at that point I had to go public, because what people were being told and what was actually happening were two completely different things. And in many ways, that hasn't changed. We get words all the time, but the actions don't match.
Becky, you too are a survivor, 8 years old, and I know every story is different, but you too, of course, it took you a long time to come to terms with what had happened to you and talk out. Is Marie right that this is a lot of words, but yet to see action?
Yes, I mean, we keep hearing him say the same thing over and over. I went back this morning and looked at 2015, what he said when he came here to the United States. And he said the same thing. We must stop bishops from covering up. We must, zero tolerance. We hear the same exact things, but yet since that time, we haven't really seen any real change. So I'm really tired of words. They're not protecting children.
What needs to be done in your opinion?
Certainly, we need to believe and listen to survivors of abuse. And that needs to come first. And like Marie and Becky have said, that, you know, there seems to be a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. So clearly more needs to be done, and that hasn't been done. We've seen that with the Pope in Chile, where he admitted that he made mistakes, and it's clear with the Pennsylvania grand jury that, you know, there seems to be more cover-up, and, you know, clearly some bishops here in the U.S. are at fault, and they need to be held accountable.
Raymond Flynn, I want you to follow on from what Jason Miller just said, but let's take into account, of course, this letter that also dropped at the same time as this visit from Vigano, that basically is calling on the Pope to resign. Does that put Francis immediately on the defensive here? What's going on within the Church to obviously complicate getting to the bottom of this decades-old crisis?
Well, I think there's sufficient pressure on the Church at this point in time, more so than there ever has been. And I think the time for really assertive, affirmative action is now. Let me just add, I've had a lot of experience working with the Church over the years on issues of charity and social and economic justice, and in a lot of favorable response by the public, Catholics, non-Catholics. Unfortunately, there hadn't been a lot of attention by law enforcement or authorities on abuses or crimes that were committed. And, you know, I don't think any institution, whether it's the White House or the Congress or the Church or any institution, can police itself. I was mayor of Boston for 10 years. And when there was a problem, I immediately turned it over to law enforcement authorities and prosecutors and let them make independent judgments and observations and punitive measures. I don't think the Church or politics can internally police itself. I think it has to be turned over to proper lay authorities and let them take action and let the pieces fall wherever they may, regardless of who it is, regardless of their position in the Church.
Well, let me just follow up on that. Why hasn't it happened so far? I mean, we're in this crisis for 30 years or more.
Well, yeah, of course it's relatively new, not really new to the victims, because they've experienced this throughout their life. But for some reason, there hasn't been a public awareness so that would bring light, such as we're seeing now, the courageous victims now coming forward, have been coming forward. And I think it's going to demand action. It should demand action. And I believe that words are not the solution. It's action, turning it over to independent, assertive law enforcement authorities and let them take action, and let the best prosecution in any kind of situation like this is public awareness, public information. Let me just say quickly.
Let me sorry, I just want to interrupt there. Sorry. I want to get to Marie to respond to that, because she was sitting on the Pontifical Council for the Protection of Minors. She resigned in frustration. So what's holding things up here? Because it doesn't sound like suddenly the revelation is that all these victims have come forward and the Catholic Church needs to do something about it. Mechanisms were set up, and yet people like Marie have resigned in frustration. Marie? Yeah,
I mean, in 20 years, I've been speaking about it, so have other victims. I don't know how this idea that it's suddenly new. We were being told by the Church 20 years ago that they were on a learning curve. They were just beginning to learn about all this. That's 20 years ago, you know? We're in a different century now. Yes, I was on the commission. I was there with other experts to advise the Pope. I was there from 2014 through to 2017. But we recommended things like an accountability tribunal, like strong best practice guidelines, which should have been imposed in every diocese in the world. And they were resisted from within the Vatican. The culture in the Church is still of self-protection. It's still of lack of taking responsibility. There is still a resistance to having men who protect these abusers, have them shown as being just as guilty. Even the ones that are eventually found guilty within the church are allowed to just walk away and resign. No findings of guilt against them, nothing. They're not having to take responsibility. And that is what's wrong. Justice must be seen to be done. But the basic problem is clericalism within the church, self-protection, and also still at the top. They live in a bubble in the Vatican, and they have this idea that this is all going to go away. And how they can think that, I don't know.
Marie, thanks, Becky. Do you agree with that? A slap on the wrist, and I mean, this is child abuse. This child molesters go to jail?
Yeah, these are horrible crimes, and I feel like, you know, we at SNAP, we've given up on changing the church. I don't believe the church is going to change. If it changes, that's great. But I think we really need to rely on secular authorities. We have contacted our entire database, asked them to contact their attorney generals and launch investigations into every diocese, much like they did in Pennsylvania. We've also contacted the Department of Justice and asked them to do a nationwide investigation. So we want the federal government to get involved in this as well, because that's where we're going to get our answers. And you find the church only changes when there's pressure. That's what happened in Chile. He only made the changes after the public outcry. So only after public outcry and pressure does the church change.
Jason, are we at a tipping point after this weekend? The letter, what we've seen from Marie and others, is this old boys network going to sort of be blown apart and priests essentially go to jail?
I don't know. It's hard to say at this point, really, right? It seems like this might be a moment in the church where this could be a tipping point, and it's hard to make of what the letter is from the papal nuncio. To me, that seems like that's someone who's upset that he lost his job and is perhaps taking it out on the Pope, when rather we should be focusing on the abuse survivors, and instead they're playing partisan politics within the church.
So you're saying this is an excuse for some within the church to try and push Francis out? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it's not clear. I think that the letter is that's a distraction now from what the real focus should be. And I agree with Marie and with Becky that we should hand this over to the authorities. But for me personally, the hierarchy may not change, but the church really is the people in the pews and the people of God. And this may be the tipping point for more people to take their fingers out of their ears and to start to realize what's really going on. And I think that might be the most important part outside of support for abuse survivors.
Yeah, Raymond Flynn, you've been reading testimony of people, churchgoers in the Catholic faith all around the world who are really upset with the church. You saw the crowd sizes in Ireland, in Chile they were thinner than expected as well. You're having sort of this move towards secularization in some societies, as well as this sex abuse scandal at the same time. The Catholic Church is having a real crisis here, correct?
Well, I always said that more lay people have to have meaningful voices in the Catholic Church. The decisions about politics, religion, business shouldn't be made exclusively by the people at the top. They should be made by the people who are the faithful of the Catholic faith as well as the people who are the consumers, who are, in this case, the victims. I think they should change the whole system around and give more power, more of a voice to the people in the pews rather than the people up in the altars.
Well, Marie, what do you think of that? People in the pews, can they make a difference? I know a lot of people have walked away from the Catholic Church because of this.
I think the only time the church makes any change is when the media and the upcry happens and things are revealed. I'm not sure people in the pews, you want them behind you, but I'm not sure the church will listen to them either. But I'd like to say one thing. The state, I agree with Becky, the state can change things. Here in Ireland, we had our reports, we had our investigations into our diocese years ago, and the state brought in new children's laws, mandatory reporting. There is no statute of limitations on this crime of child abuse. And in America, I know the church is fighting against the statute of limitations being done away with or being dropped. And at the same time, they're saying they want justice for survivors. And that is, those two things are totally opposite. If the statute of limitations was done away with, survivors, more perpetrators would be criminally prosecuted, and survivors would have justice. So the church, again, are saying one thing, doing another. But the state authorities have to be involved. And the laity, the people in the pews, they do have to speak out. And here in Ireland, I know maybe we've been talking out longer. As I say, it's nearly 30 years. But the people in the pews here are speaking out. But they're also speaking with their feet, and they're walking away from the church. And the church's moral authority, certainly in Ireland, as I said recently here, has fallen off a cliff. They have no credibility anymore.
Thanks, Murray. Becky, is there anywhere where prosecutions you've seen have actually worked that you would hold up as a model globally for getting justice?
Well, you know, in Virginia, there is no statute of limitations criminally. And I know
so that means it doesn't matter how long since the crime has happened, you can bring the perpetrator to justice.
And I know of 2 cases where it happened decades ago, but yet the police were able to prosecute, and both of those perpetrators were put in jail. So changing these laws can make a huge difference. Because, you know, someone abuses a child, and we can't prevent all child abuse, but that could affect one child. But when the church covers up or someone covers up that abuse, that abuser can abuse over and over and over again.
Yeah, you no longer attend church. I mean, you felt, obviously you're a victim, but you also felt victimized by your church, didn't you? Tell us a little bit about that.
I raised my kids Catholic. You know, I was abused at the age of 8, and it wasn't until 48 when I started dealing with my abuse. And at that point, I went to the church. And they handled my case so badly, and all I wanted was them to tell me I wasn't going to hell for telling on a priest, that they were going to do something about it, and that they were sorry.
So the only thing you got was you weren't going to hell?
Yes. And I didn't get any of those things from the first priest I met, so I fell away from the church, and quite honestly, I fell away from God as well.
Jason, this is difficult for a lot of people because also a lot of these children become adults. The forensic evidence isn't always there, and powerful institutions like the Catholic Church can push back. What's the way around this?
Clearly, the answer is that, you know, we need the outside civil authorities to help, and the church needs to talk the talk in the United States, as well as need to talk the talk and walk the walk. And clearly, they're not doing that at this point.
Raymond Flynn, there have been some isolated successes in prosecutions in the United States. You talked about Boston. Do you think there are any examples that could provide a way forward here for the Vatican globally?
Oh, I think there is. I think the more the people get involved, as your guests have already indicated, the more that people get involved, the more power that they will have unified collectively. And that didn't happen before. There were individuals courageously speaking out, but the more people that get involved now as a unity, the powerful they will become. That will affect politics, that will affect the media, and it will also affect the church. It always does. It depends now on the public. If they get involved, change happens. If the people don't get involved, everything will go back to the status quo.
Murray, have you lost faith in the Catholic Church to do anything? Because, you know, you want people to get involved to make change, but also people are walking away.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. I mean, I agree that at the end of the day, the state and civil society has to take a hand. But unfortunately, as we know, the Catholic Church is global. It's around the world. It's actually burgeoning in countries in Africa and Asia, countries like that. And we have to think of the children there who are being victimized right now, and where there are no survivors able to speak out. And that's why I keep working for the change, the church to change, so that they will ensure that there are bishops in those countries where the civil authorities will have a very long way from becoming involved, where in those countries, those children will be made safer. Instead of waiting until it all comes to the fore in America, Australia, Ireland, France, Chile, all these other countries. But it's the children that are being abused now that are not being thought about in so many countries where the church is exploding in size and hugely popular. And we tend in the West to forget about those countries, but we can't forget about those children.
Murray, so in spite of everything, you're not walking away from the Catholic Church, and you think that things can change in the Catholic Church? Because Becky here's not convinced. She's walked away.
Well, I'm not convinced they can change. I tried, I did 3 years working with them at Vatican level, and found that the resistance there to change was too strong. I had to walk away. I had to walk away to make it public, that this on the inside was exactly the way it was. I know we all knew that, but it was still important to make that gesture. They can change, of course they can change. It's whether they have the will to change or not, and whether the men in the church have the will and can see how they are not only destroying children's lives, but destroying their own church by not making the changes that are necessary. Will they come to that realization, or will they continue as they are? I don't know. Hope is not a word I use. I ran out of hope a long time ago, but perseverance is, and I will keep persevering.
Raymond Flynn, she talks about the men in the church. The top man is Pope Francis. We've seen some very interesting messages from him. Sorry, but again, Marie, others wanting action. How does Pope Francis control this, get his hands around it?
Let me just add one point, and I don't want to be naive about this, but trying to change people's minds and attitudes and institutions is very difficult. The Catholics have to remember that they go to church. They're faithful because of the teachings of Jesus Christ, not because of any priest, not because of any pope. That's not why I go to church. That's not why I ever went to church. We have a loyalty to Jesus Christ and his teaching, and if we rally around that, we can bring about the constructive change that we need in the Catholic Church today across the world.
Becky, do you agree with that? Ignore the priests and talk to God?
You know,
it's difficult, right?
For me,
in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, for me growing up, they were one and the same. And so it was really hard for me to separate God from the priest that abused me. So for many victims, it's really hard, and that's why, you know, it's very hard. Some people I can't go into a church. And so, you know, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to believe in God, but when you feel God abandon you, sometimes it's very difficult to reach out.
Becky and Marie and all, I guess I really want to thank you for joining, but especially you two for sharing your stories as well. That's all we have time for on this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C.